Muhammad adored everything about his neighborhood. The neighbors were welcoming and the general atmosphere reflected a close-knit community. But what captivated him most were the endless opportunities for mischief and mayhem alongside a group of like-minded kids. Muhammad naturally rose to become one of the leaders among the children, claiming his place at the top of that inevitable hierarchy that forms when enough kids gather together. His younger brother Rahman was his constant companion, though content to let Muhammad lead while he stayed in the background, hanging out at the front of their house or by the little restaurant around the corner. There was another corner where they would play games and shoot dice, a little further from the watchful eyes of their parents. The boys played with whatever toys their parents could afford, but like most children, they also crafted their own entertainment. They converted broomsticks into horses by tying string around the top and placing them between their legs, then hollered at the tops of their voices as they galloped up and down the street without a care in the world. And like any growing boys of that era, their group of friends played cowboys and Indians. Muhammad, having typically taken charge, was always adamant about being the cowboy, and would insist that Rahman had to be the Indian. Back then, cowboys were portrayed as the heroes in westerns, while Indians were cast as villains. Muhammad always wanted to be the hero, because heroes always won. Beyond games and play, even in those early childhood days, the Ali brothers were fiercely competitive. Close in age, they challenged each other in almost everything they pursued. Muhammad in particular strove to triumph in whatever game or competition he entered, whether racing to see who could run fastest, who could jump highest, playing marbles or jacks or hide and seek. Losing was simply out of the question. Pro wrestling dominated television screens in the 1950s, and their parents religiously watched it whenever the temperamental TV set in their house could be convinced to work. Naturally, Muhammad tried to emulate the wrestlers he saw, usually at Rahman's expense. Sometimes their grappling grew boisterous as they wrestled across the living room floor, though it wasn't always a one-sided affair. Rahman always carried a little more size during their youth, while Muhammad remained skinnier and lanky. In truth, Muhammad wasn't particularly interested in athletic pursuits until after he discovered boxing. There were other kids who were physically more imposing, even if he possessed undeniable quickness and competitive fire. When it came to sports, Muhammad never really enjoyed basketball or baseball, the games that almost every other boy their age wanted to play as often as possible. Across the street from their friend Adrian's house, there was a large plot of empty land where the neighborhood kids would congregate. And although Muhammad didn't really care much for organized sport, he would take part sometimes, just for the fun of it. He didn't take a shine to tackle football because, ironically, he felt it was just too rough. He didn't mind playing touch football instead, and he was very good at running and evasive maneuvering, twisting away from the other boys' efforts to tackle him, the way he would one day dance away from the greatest fighters of his generation. Even back then, he was boasting. The thrill of a challenge just switched something on inside of him, and he'd yell, "I'm too fast for you. There's no way that you can catch me. Watch me score this touchdown." And thanks to his prodigious natural athletic talent, more than any love of the game, he would back up this confidence, most of the time. Luckily, more often than not, Muhammad and Rahman were on the same team, just as they would be through much of the rest of their lives. And those summer days growing up were very special and dear to their hearts. They were just innocent kids with boundless energy. Muhammad was always the life of the party and tried to inject a dose of enthusiasm into whatever he did. Rahman, on the other hand, took things way too seriously, at least according to his brother. Though he was typically resigned to his role, he was 18 months younger after all, he sometimes let his frustration get the better of him. Even then, things would rarely get physical between them. Their mother's quiet disapproval and their father's more hands-on discipline made sure of that. And for the most part, sibling rivalry was nothing but good for Rahman. Muhammad wanted to be liked and appreciated. He had that in him right from the word go. There was always an attempt to impress others and stand out from the group. There was, though, one area where Rahman stood apart from his brother growing up, and as fate would have it, that was the one that upset Muhammad the most. To put it simply, Rahman always found it easy to talk to girls. It often surprises people, but when they were young boys, Rahman was more of a ladies' man than his brother, and he certainly started having girlfriends before Muhammad ever did. The girls in their neighborhood and school knew them both, and Muhammad would always be making eyes in their direction, but he lacked confidence when it came to approaching them and was absolutely petrified to ask them out. No matter how much he tried to conceal his bashfulness, it was always apparent, and as brash as he was, as radiant as his smile might have been, the occasional smile back was the closest he'd get to flirting, at least in those formative years. Almost unbelievably, some girls actually perceived Muhammad as what you might now call a nerd, according to a few that Rahman spoke with. It was because he didn't participate in football and basketball, the sports that were seen as being the preserve of the real men. It certainly wasn't a lack of looks. It was more to do with his personality, which had its own stutters and starts behind all that bravado. And if anything, Muhammad's attempts to rectify the situation made matters worse. He'd run alongside the bus and call out the names of the girls and boys, and most of the girls would sink in their seats, embarrassed more for him than themselves. Muhammad, of course, couldn't stand the fact that Rahman was getting the attention from the girls, and back then it was maybe the only thing that had a chance of driving a wedge between the brothers. On the way home from school, for instance, Rahman would usually get off the bus early to walk his girlfriend home and hang out with her at her house. The same scene played out more than once. They'd be hanging out together, only to hear a knock on the door and answer it to find Muhammad there, his face a picture of innocence. "Hey, Rahman, Mom wants you to come home now, you're in trouble," would be the typical line. "She told me to get you and said she wants you to come home right now." Rahman, fearing the worst, would apologize to his girlfriend and run back home, about 4 blocks in total, thoughts swirling in his head about what he could possibly be in trouble for. "Mom, what's wrong?" he would ask as soon as they walked through the door, only to be met with a blank face and the revelation that their mother, confused at his sudden appearance, didn't have the faintest idea what he was talking about. Rahman fell for this scheme of Muhammad's over and over again, with his brother repeating the charade whenever he got the itch. More than once, Rahman accused him of being jealous. On a couple of occasions, they exchanged a few words, and those days were really the only times in their childhood that Rahman would really get mad at his brother. This wasn't a game he was going to beat him in, and it must have stung him to see his little brother outshining him in one of the few areas he still didn't quite understand. And yet, however heated their words became, there was never a time in their entire childhood when they came to blows. No girl was seriously going to ruin their relationship. Whether they were chasing girls, playing touch football, or coming up with games of their own devising, their parents had one golden rule that was strictly enforced, and that was to be back at home before it got dark. This was pretty common. Back in those days, it was out of the ordinary for kids to leave the house in the early morning and roam the streets all day, not returning before dusk, getting up to whatever mischief they might throughout the day. Most people in their neighborhood didn't have the luxury of wearing a watch, but their father's solution was simple. "Don't tell me you don't know what time it is. You'd better be home before the streetlights turn on, otherwise you're in trouble." And so every night a familiar scene would repeat itself. As soon as it started getting dark, streetlights would start to come on, and the brothers would race them all the way home. They wouldn't always make it. If they were late, they'd be treated to a good old-fashioned spanking. The bathroom was the typical punishment chamber. Muhammad would go first, leaving Rahman to wait outside for his father to call him after he'd finished with his brother. Muhammad never really appreciated the harsh treatment their father administered for lateness and other infractions, but Cassius Clay Sr. had his own ideas of how things were supposed to be, and he had what you might call a zealous attitude to keeping his sons in check, a way of raising his voice and a mean look that would etch itself across his face that confirmed what was coming. More often than not, seeing that would make the boys straighten up, but by then, it would be too late. Rules were there to be obeyed, and his father was going to make sure they took heed. Perhaps because of this, and a few other things, Muhammad's relationship with his father became somewhat distant before he left his teens. When it's said this way, it doesn't mean they had a big falling out, but that special bond that some fathers and sons are able to forge was lost before it could ever begin. Contrary to what some biographers have written, though, the brothers' upbringing in Louisville had no element of what could be called physical abuse. First of all, their father never intentionally tried to inflict unnecessary pain. Most of the time, Muhammad and Rahman didn't even take note of his discipline because they'd break the rules over and over again without giving much thought to the consequences. Of course, their father disciplined them physically now and again, but in the 1940s and 1950s, the practice was deemed necessary. Giving kids a strapping was certainly nothing out of the ordinary in black communities, especially when the consequences of stepping out of line could be so grave. In hindsight, Muhammad realized that his father had the right intentions all along, and he came to terms with the fact that it was for their own good. It was dangerous being out late, in their neighborhood especially, and whatever else on his mind, Cassius Sr. didn't want his sons to get caught up in the ugly scenarios that played themselves out on the streets nightly in their town. Even back then, there were drugs to worry about, as well as robberies and fights and brutal stabbings, and as the father of 2 black boys, he had plenty of extra cause for concern. Furthermore, in the 1950s, prejudice was spiraling out of control in parts of America. The violence instigated by the various racist groups that were creating trouble was particularly rife in the South, and in Louisville, it never felt far away. As young boys growing up, it very quickly became apparent to Muhammad and Rahman that being black made them different. In their town, the blacks endeavored to stay on their side of town in a sort of semi-isolation. They didn't encounter much trouble in their own neighborhood, but elsewhere, their race was shoved in their faces all the time. Tensions were high, and the potential for trouble was never far away. One story in particular illustrates the kind of discrimination that was accepted as a fact of life during their formative years. When Muhammad was 8, their mother took him downtown, only to bring him home with tears running down his cheeks. It turned out that he had wanted a drink and stood outside a store crying for water, except that it was a store that didn't serve blacks. Their mother took him in and asked the shop assistant for a drink of water regardless, but the woman, as she told her sons later, was obviously afraid. She told Odessa Clay that she'd lose her job if she served Negroes. Here was an upset kid, gulping back tears and only asking for something to quench his thirst, and his mother couldn't even buy water in a store in his own hometown. In the end, the situation came to a head when the store's security personnel walked up to her and Muhammad and asked them to leave in case the situation escalated. Odessa was never a confrontational person, so she didn't make a big fuss, but that incident and others constantly reminded the brothers that they were effectively second-class citizens in their own town. Their race determined where they could eat, where their father could work, which parks they could play in, and how they would be treated if they broke the law. That stuck with Muhammad and Rahman for a long time. Even though their mother looked almost white to both of them, she was still treated as colored in everyday life, and even when the boys came to terms with it, they would never be able to accept it. Muhammad in particular would often ask their parents why black people had to suffer so. It was partly this climate that meant that, even when they were in their teens, it was rare that Muhammad and Rahman would venture too far from the West End on their own. They had been warned by their parents and by other members of the community, and knew what could potentially happen even in a town as relatively enlightened as Louisville. The only real trouble they encountered was outside the vicinity of the West End, if they were in the wrong part of town, the all-white part. But still, the fact that there was so little they could do never lost its sting. It wasn't uncommon for white boys in a car to pull up and hurl racial abuse. "Hey, nigger, what are you doing here?" they would shout, trying to goad the brothers into a situation that could easily turn ugly. It always hit home, but Muhammad and Rahman did their best to stay out of trouble, only too aware of the beatings and lynchings that were still occurring in places like Mississippi. The Deep South was another world, but a world that their parents often brought to their attention, showing them pictures of Emmett Till's disfigured face when his killers were acquitted of murder, reminding them of what could happen if they dared to retaliate even in the face of hatred. Despite those tensions, though, and even though he had his own frustrations to take out in life, Muhammad never bullied anyone. Rahman could attest to that. Yes, Muhammad had a boastful side to him, and he certainly had the physical skills to back up his words, but no one ever said he bullied them or that he was a mean person in school or in their neighborhood. Moreover, Rahman never saw him do wrong by anyone who didn't bring it on themselves. Muhammad was extremely close to his younger brother, so anywhere he went, you could bet your last dollar that you'd see Rahman with him. Their parents had made it clear to them at every step that they were to look out for each other whenever they were out of their sight. And Muhammad took pride in the fact that Rahman was his little brother. He was very protective, and any kid around them was aware of the closeness they shared. They knew that you couldn't mess with one brother, you had to mess with both of them. If somebody was going to bully Muhammad or try to instigate trouble with him, even if he was certain to lose, Rahman would jump in there and fight wholeheartedly. There was no way you could have fought his big brother without Rahman involved, and Muhammad would intervene if anyone tried hurting him. They got in their fair share of scraps that way, but it wasn't until Muhammad was 12 years old that they discovered they might just have a talent for it.